This online module was created on the traditional lands of the Wadawurrung people. We acknowledge them as traditional owners and pay our respects to their elders past, present and emerging. This training module is part of a series of free videos provided by the Surf Coast Shire to assist community groups, clubs and incorporated associations. The series covers the topics of fundraising and grants, attracting members and helpers, strategic planning and succession, financial management, and event planning. This one's about fundraising and grants. We hope they help you. Here's the aim of the session. All of the resources that you'll hear about are listed on our webpage, the one where you found this module. Feel free to download them and use them. Here's what we'll cover this session. If you understand the answers to the first 3 questions, you'll understand your chances of a funding application being successful. Sometimes it helps to think of what an assessment panel might want to hear from you. Most of our time will be spent on the big 6. Why would grants even be offered? There are usually a number of reasons, and it could be any of these or more than one. Community development, creating ownership, empowerment, engagement or connection across the community. Solving a problem or issue. Creating a partnership with the funder. Or just plain value, getting more bang for the buck because volunteers will be involved. How are they run? Generally, they have promotion, which can be advertising, email, web, social media, a release of the guidelines to let you know what the grant's about and under what conditions will money be given. There's an application and inquiry time. Sometimes there's an inquiry time. Then there's a closing date that's usually clear, followed by assessment of the grant applications and recommendations to decision makers. And that's an important point. The people who receive your grant application don't always get to be the decision makers. Okay, so it may not always look this big or formal, but treat the assessment panel as if it was. Because usually a grant assessment panel will be gathered. And they usually include the people who are providing the funding and people who have expertise in the kinds of things you're applying for. Some people call that subject matter experts. So when you're writing a grant application, don't fudge anything. Be careful. Make sure that if you make a statement, you can back it up. Sometimes, if you're applying for grants to a level of government, sometimes politics gets involved. You have no control over that. You can't prevent it, so don't worry about it. It's important to understand that the people assessing your application aren't always the deciding persons. Some of you may remember Ros Kelly and her infamous whiteboard. Some of you may have seen about Bridget McKenzie's application process or award process during the sports grants. You have to accept that the deciders may have favourites, they may have prejudices. Things sometimes happen that you have no control of. Sometimes the grant announcement comes to you with a quiet word to get a photo opportunity, but we can't possibly tell you that you've got a grant. Usually that comes with a request for confidentiality, and you'll need to keep that confidentiality if somebody taps you quietly. It's really important to understand that the implementation process, that is doing the thing if you get money, is as important as getting the money, because you'll usually be required to either provide progress reports for the project and funding. You may not though. And then when it ends, if you get funding, you're going to have to do conclusions or a final report and then a quit for the money. So before you even get to the application, you need to understand that you can only control your application and meeting the deadline. So make those things count. Make sure your application has merit. And while politics can get involved, please don't rely on your political connections. If it's a local government grant, don't assume that just because you know the councillor, you're in like Flynn. However, that said, if you get a local member to support it, that can be helpful, but don't assume that they have control over the decision. This may disappoint some of you. Really, that's all there is? It isn't rocket science, but it is really important, and it's not always as simple as it looks. All funding bodies want answers to these kinds of questions. They're not necessarily in this order, and they're very rarely ever worded this simply. So here we go. Who are you? Never ever assume that the panel knows you, even if you happen to know who's on the panel. But that's unlikely because usually the panel members want to stay anonymous, so they can't be lobbied. So use whatever you can that paints the picture best. Is your group just your town, or is it wider than your town? Funding bodies are accountable for where the money goes. So help them to trust you. Paint the picture. Whether it's a local government grant, a state government grant, or a federal grant, it doesn't matter. They all want to avoid a problem. Even philanthropic bodies don't want their reputation questioned. Your application needs to show them who you are and that you're reliable, but you don't need to rabbit on. Dot points are a good way to do it. This was an application from a football group that wanted people to know it was a big club. It had both netball and football. And it gave an indication of the kind of people, what kind of support they have. Why would they want to give you money? Again, be concise. Feel free to quote and use references. Those websites have a whole lot of information about different types of data. So why is this funding request an issue for your group? Why should it be funded? Can you back it up? Do you have data that shows what problem you're trying to solve or what strength you're working on? Can you find evidence to back that up? You should try. It really helps to paint the picture about what it is you're trying to achieve and more particularly why you are. This bit can really help your application because not everybody sees the world the way you see it. It helps them to see what's motivating you. Those websites don't need to be written down. They're in the resources pack that I mentioned that's also on the website where you found this. The what? Again, if you're familiar with the KISS principle, it really does work. The KISS principle? Keep it simple, stupid. Name what you'll do. Be really concise about that. Don't waffle. You should be able to paint the picture pretty briefly. For example, we're going to build a barbecue using our labour and purchased materials to support community connections after the game or the meeting or the working bees or whatever it is. Or we're going to buy indoor bowls, mats and balls to increase senior participation in activities. Maybe we're going to have a party to launch the new club colours or finished renovations or annual community event, whatever it is, that we know will be self-sustainable, and maybe you need to show the numbers for the projections. There is a little bit of how in this section. It helps to explain a little bit of how you'll do the what, but be clear about what it is. Having clear timelines adds to that dependable feel. This is a group that knows what they're about and how they're going to go about it and when it's going to start and finish. Be sure you understand the grant's assessment and announcement timing, for example. See the grant guidelines and be careful, because you need to be realistic. Are potential delays covered? Does everyone in the timetable know when they're needed? You'll probably get held to the timing unless you can renegotiate an unpredictable event. And remember, if you want to build something, winter's not a great time. So if you're going to get the money in April, for example, you may want to tell them you're not going to start until September. That's realistic and sensible, and it sets you up as having thought about it. If they also delay their timing, they've at least got an understanding that you are going to start here and finish there. So if you're 3 months late starting, we can probably predict you're going to be 3 months late finishing. Again, you've given them notice that if you get funded, here's the dates that you're going to work on. Gantt charts, I'm going to deal with in the next slide. You don't have to have them, but they can be helpful. Henry Gantt invented the Gantt chart in 1910. Probably useless fact, but doesn't matter. It's used to show related tasks and project progress. Big projects are often managed with Gantt charts that look really complicated, but when you're used to using them, everybody understands clearly what they need to do when. It isn't always needed, but if you're familiar with them, it's another way to show you're absolutely on it, and somebody with project management experience has had a hand in your application. A Gantt chart's just a shorthand way of keeping things on track and visible, and they may help you keep to deadlines. If you're not familiar with Gantt charts, don't worry about it, but you might want to just list the dates that you're going to get things done. The point is, it helps that feeling of solidity and dependability and organised nature of your group or your application. It shows that you've thought about what needs to be done, and it can help strengthen your chances of getting funds. The where is a really interesting thing. It's not always obvious. If it's a place, Google Maps can really help. If you can cut and paste a picture of the area, that can give them a bit of an understanding. And maybe photos of where you're going to do the thing, if that helps. Also, where is the benefit? Is the benefit a place? Is it a part of the community? Is it the region? But be real here. If the benefit is not going to happen across a broad area, don't put that down. Don't include half a shire if the benefits are more localised to one town. That's okay. It will help them in their assessment. Again, if you're overstretching, it may start to unravel their faith in your dependability. Be clear about finances. How much do you want? Can you prove it? Quotes can help. It's even possible in a grant application to copy a price list and add that if that's appropriate. How much are you bringing to this? There's a thing called sweat equity. How many hours will your volunteers contribute? Don't count the grant writing, because guidelines usually say you can't, but if you can, fine, count it. Provide simple calculations, things like the volunteer hours by the estimated value of those hours by how many working bees or whatever. You should be able to add up how much time you're going to spend doing what you're going to do, and that contribution is worth something, because it shows how much you're committed to actually adding value to their money. So what do you expect to achieve? Can you measure it? Because if you can't measure it, it's going to be a bit more difficult to say whether you have or haven't succeeded. And not everything's tangible. It's not as simple as saying we got the building passed for inspection. Sometimes you can count the number of people that attended. You can take photos of the happy event. If finished is a date or a thing delivered or an event, help the assessment panel to see the finish ribbon. How will they know that you're finished? You should be able to show them. Reading the guidelines is a crucial thing to do. If you do that first, then you won't be wasting your time on an application that you were never going to be eligible for in the first place. If you are part of a group, a club, or an association, be sure that the whole committee are agreed on the funding application. Because if anybody knows somebody in your group and has a quiet chat to one of your committee members who then says, didn't know about that, you're pulling out a whole lot of ground from under your application. So make sure the committee are on board. Get help where you can. Writing is not for everyone. If you've got someone in your midst who's a good grant writer, or you know some other group that's been successful, why not talk to them about whether you can get some help? And you need to meet or beat the deadline. By beating the deadline, I mean getting in early. Late applications are usually excluded. Oftentimes there are too many people applying for the funds available. And if that's the case, you've just handed them on a plate a reason to keep you out of the funding assessment. And it's really common, well, it's possible that an electronic submission that you have to email in or use their application process online, if there's going to be a problem, it's going to happen on the last day when everybody all wants to apply at the same time. So if you can submit it the day before, you're probably likely to have far less grief. And only worry about the things you can control. Reading the guidelines, putting your best shot at writing, making sure you've got things to back it up. Those things are all important. Those things you can control. Once you submit it, there is no control, but you will have given yourself your best chance. And often a peak body, if you're part of a wider association, sometimes they have their own resources and advice. As I said, you may know another group that seems to run pretty well. Why not talk to them? And council has staff that can support and assist you in grant writing or in things volunteering. Feel free to contact. That's all we had for you. I hope it was helpful. Feel free to share this if you need to, and do contact counsel if you need some help.